Well, this word, epiphany, it's a strange word, but as I said last week, it means revelation. This is the season following Christmas when we think about God revealing God's self to us. And it follows Christmas because of the great revelation of God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, revealed to the world in the manger in Bethlehem, revealed to the world in the visit of the Magi, revealed to the world at Jesus' baptism in the Jordan. This week, we see the revelation of God in the calling of the disciples. And we're blessed, this year to have John's account of that revealing. "Come and see," says Jesus of Nazareth to the first disciples, Andrew and his brother, Simon Peter. It's just in the little bit before we started to read. The thing with revelation is that it is more effective when we show other people than when we tell others about something. It's also something that has to be experienced personally. Sometimes, however, even a personal encounter with God can go unrecognised or be hard for us to understand. Samuel's experience was personal, wasn't it? But it was still puzzling to him. Now, I've always loved this account of the child, Samuel, being called by God. Now, this week I heard someone, another priest, say that after they read the story as a child, they were constantly waiting for God to call them. I have to say that wasn't quite how I felt. I've just felt envious of the fact that Samuel had heard God. How wonderful to be called by God so directly. And it was much harder than that to hear my own call, though God was preparing me for a long time. But the call of God isn't always to ordained ministry. God is like a parent who is constantly calling all of us to something. Sometimes it's being called to a job, and sometimes it's being called to a joy, and sometimes it's both at once. Samuel heard the call clearly, but wasn't sure of the source. And even Eli, God's representative, took a little while to get it, didn't he? But God had work for Samuel to do, and he obviously needed long training in the art of listening to God. And Samuel goes on and is the spokesperson of God for David and beyond. And what about these disciples that we meet in the Gospel? They're invited to come and see, but they may or may not have known what it was that they were looking at. The revelation is a strange business. Jesus was in the region of the Jordan, and John the Baptizer sees him and announces that he is the one that they're waiting for. And two of John's disciples, one of whom was Andrew, Peter's brother, ask Jesus where he's staying. And Jesus invites them to come and see. And they spend the day with him. Now, this word staying, when they say where he's staying, it's a very important word in John's Gospel. It means abiding or dwelling or sojourning, or perhaps even pitching your tent. And John uses the word extensively, particularly in the final discourse. Now, he's already used it in the preface to the Gospel when he says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's the same word, full of grace and truth. So when the disciples ask where Jesus is abiding, it's somehow much more significant than asking which B&B he's staying in. Andrew and Simon conclude right here and right now that Jesus is the Messiah. It's interesting that in John's Gospel, this revelation is right at the beginning. But in the Synoptics, it takes a lot more evidence before they come to the same conclusion. And, John is perhaps preempting the revelation. It's hard to say. As humans, we can be aware of something and yet still take a long time to process it. There's also something about recognition here in today's section of the Gospel. Jesus says that he knows Nathanael. He says, "Here is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." And this recognition of Nathanael as a person leads Nathanael to put his faith in Jesus as the Son of God. And you know, that's very like the psalm that we read, isn't it? God knows us from before our gestation. Jesus, I think, smiles and says to him, "Do you believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree? You'll see greater things than these. You'll see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." Jesus is promising him, as a precious and known person, revelation that is connected to the covenant of God. There are two references back to the Old Testament covenant here. The first is a bit of a play on words. When Jesus says Nathanael is a true Israelite, he's referring to Jacob, or Israel, as he was renamed when he wrestled with God. Now, Jacob was a trickster, but nonetheless, God revealed God's covenant, or his agreement with man, to Jacob. And the second reference is also to Jacob and his vision of angels ascending and descending. You remember when he's sleeping with his head pillowed on the stone and he sees the angels ascending and descending? And that is something to do with the traffic between God and man, or the heavenly realms and the earthly. So this complex series of references would have been much more clearly heard by John's listeners as referring to the promise that God had made to bless his people Israel. God has revealed God's self through this nation. The question, of course, is, why cannot God just reveal God's self to humans, to all humans, all the time? And it seems to me that the answer is something about free will. God gives us the opportunity to see and hear and experience God, but God doesn't force that upon us. It would be much easier if God did. But for some reason, which is hard for us to understand, God has given us free will. And we sort of saw that a bit in that Corinthians reading, didn't we? God could compel us, but God chooses not to. And so the revelation is there to be seen and heard and experienced, but we have to choose it. And God is always preceding us. God is there, waiting for us before we sit under the fig tree. And so we see God, and then we have to choose to follow. Jesus found Philip and called him to follow him. Philip follows, becomes Jesus' disciple. Philip could have refused. He could have first refused to see, and then he could have refused to follow. But like him, Jesus calls us to follow. Part of that following is in the getting to know God and seeing the greater things than these that Jesus promises. Like Samuel, we have to choose to get up and listen to God. And then, like Samuel, we will be used by God for great things. And it's not only the ordained who follow and are trained and then call others to come and see. All of us, each one of us in this room, are called to come and see ourselves and then to draw others into relationship with God, just as Philip did with Nathanael. In order for us to perceive God's revelation of God's self, we need to develop an awareness. We need to practice our listening to God. Samuel had no trouble hearing God, but he needed to learn that it was God that he was hearing. And some of us are a bit like that. We need to practice. That is, we need to keep doing the listening to God that will allow us to hear. And some of us are like the disciples who, at least here in John's Gospel, recognise who is speaking to them. but they still have a long journey with Jesus before they're fully aware of who he is and before that revelation is complete. And I think the truth is we're all the same. It takes us the whole of our lives to fully recognise God, and then perhaps we haven't reached that point. This is a process for us. The psalmist tells us that God knows us and loves us from the very beginning of our creation as individuals, and yet it takes us a lifetime to process this. So what can we do about it? Well, let me encourage you to make this year a year when we will strive together to understand and to know the revelation of God. I'll be providing opportunities for us to grow in our spiritual awareness of God through quiet days, through meditation groups and reading groups. And of course, people can pursue this on their own as well. The constant practice of listening to God is open to everyone. The important thing is to be open to epiphany, open to God's revealing of God's self. The other thing that we will all find is that in bringing others to come and see our own relationship with God, our own experience of God will grow, and we will be blessed in the process. God will be revealed to us. You will see greater things than these, is Jesus' promise to each of us. And our reply, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.